Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Critical Perspectives. I'm here with my co host, Vanessa Beeley, and we are very excited to bring you yet another episode of these rather deep dives, rants, streams of consciousness in hopefully a more organized way than all the chaos in the world, at least. It's kind of hard because there's so much. Chaos in the news. There's always something going on, even when it seems like it's quiet. And we were talking about things happening, right? Something happening soon when things were too quiet. And then, of course, things once again kick off in Syria. And Vanessa is honestly one of the most just very knowledgeable people on Syria for years. I mean, this is if you don't know that, you should. She has not just the analysis of it geopolitically, but there's an on the ground and also historical need to understand Syria because it's not a simple black and white issue. It's not a simple binary type of analysis that's required here. It's a lot more complex, mainly because this is, I would say, organized chaos, destabilization that has it's not the way the West is framing it, like just factions fighting amongst each other because this is the way they are. It is a purposeful attack by the same Zionist Western, particularly U.S. forces that have been laid out historically for decades, and I would say, even close to 100 years or so in the region. This is very, very similar to the destabilizations that we have seen by the CIA playbook over and over again in Iraq. We've seen it in Afghanistan. We've seen it throughout the attempts in Iran as well, formerly. And I want to allow Vanessa to try to explain this in a way that I think hopefully won't be too much, because even, Vanessa was telling me, like, even when she is going through things, she has to kind of take a step back because there's so much information. So this, I just want to start off by saying I will also be talking about Trump's recent attacks, and not just against Putin, but threats made against Russia, and how that also plays a role into, I think, where the US is going. We'll touch on that. And if we have time, we'll touch on a few more things, Vanessa. And I want to let you get started with this, but there's just a multi-layered, I guess, geopolitical type of scenario happening in Syria. Obviously, for me, it's not surprising that we're here because of the fact that Damascus fell, because of the fact that Bashar al-Assad was ousted in a coup, because of all of this. But a lot of people are asking questions like, how is this possible? How could Israel turn on Jolani because Jolani is their guy? I mean, why is this happening now? Where is Jolani? It's like, where's Waldo? Where's Jolani? Where's he at? And so I kind of want to start off by allowing you to answer those questions. But, just so everybody knows, there's various factions at play here. It's impossible to go over all of them. But right now we're hearing about the Druze, HTS, the Bedouins, and there's just other factions in Takfiri factions. And then, of course, there's also the US-backed Kurdish factions. So there's a lot going on right now. And really, let's just have Vanessa take over and go right to it.
Okay, well, I think, first of all, what I'll do is kind of go around the clock of Syria so that people have at least an idea. I have gone into huge detail about all the different factions within the different areas in Syria, but that will be here all night if I go into huge depth right now. So if you go from basically the northwest across the northern border. That's pretty much the Syrian National Army, which is the former Muslim Brotherhood factions, the Free Syrian Army, the ones that Obama was funding through Timber Sycamore, the so-called moderates that are effectively totally under the guardianship of Turkey. So Erdogan and Turkey have annexed northern Syria down as far as Aleppo, the largest industrial city in Syria, through the Syrian National Army. There are also Turkish military bases on Syrian soil, but they haven't been able to advance further than southern Idlib because basically Turkey has bombed them whenever they have. So again, we're looking at a situation where although Turkey and Israel are allies, and Turkey has been supplying oil and metals for weapon manufacturing and so on throughout the genocide against the Gazans, the Palestinians in Gaza. The oil, of course, coming from Baku and coming through Turkish territory. And they've had long-standing intelligence agreements, surveillance agreements in the region. However, when it comes to the Neo-Ottoman Empire and Greater Israel, then of course Greater Israel takes precedence, and that is also how Trump perceives the situation. Trump will be looking at everything through the Israeli lens, and that goes for any president, anyone in power in the US. They're going to look at everything through the Israeli lens, not through the Turkish lens. Although Turkey might be useful in certain situations, it's not a priority as Israel is. And then in the northeast, you have the Kurdish, as I call them, the Contras, effectively under the control of the United States, to some degree collaborating with ISIS, to another degree competing with ISIS for territory, power, and status, and controlling the ISIS holding camps in the northeast, which I think... I can't remember the exact numbers, but large numbers of ISIS fighters and their families, which at the moment are being streamed into Iraq to carry out attacks against the Iraqi resistance factions there. Coming down the eastern flank, which is on the border with Jordan and Iraq, you have the illegal US base at Al Tanaf, where again, they're training another faction of the former Free Syrian Army, which has advanced as far as about 20 kilometers from the borders of eastern Damascus, so the perimeter of Damascus city. In the southeast, you have the Druze, which are basically, they're in the headlines right now. Mm-hmm. The Druze are not one, homogenous sect. They're made up of a number of factions. Those that are led by the name that most people will be seeing in the news, which is Sheikh Hikmat Hirji, is aligned with Israel. But there are other factions that are against both Jolani and Israel and who have refused to disarm. They've refused to be integrated into Jolani's new army. I wouldn't really call it an army, but band of mercenaries made up of Syrian Takfiris and foreign Takfiris. So it's very complex, even within the sect itself. And then going again around to the southwest, you have Dara and Quneitra. From the fall of Damascus in December last year, Israel advanced almost immediately beyond the 1967 kind of a demarcation zone, which was established in 1974 after Israel annexed the Syrian Golan territory in the 67 war. It advanced beyond that, took over control of Mount Hermon, which is one of the most strategic areas in that kind of southwestern corner bordering Lebanon, because it gives Israel really surveillance over both Syria and Lebanon. But in Dara, of course, you have, to a degree, the pro-Russian former Takfiri fighters who, during the peace process in 2018, came under the control of Russia the Russian 5th Corps, and they became known as the 8th Brigade. And Ahmed al-Awda, who is the leader of those brigades, again, is in competition with Jolani. He was the first one to enter Damascus back in December last year, not HTS, which is very interesting. And according to many sources, they actually escorted President Assad safely to the airport to be taken to Khaimimim and then on to Moscow. As far as I know, Ahmed al-Awda is now in Russia. I have conflicting reports on that. Some reports say that he's back in Syria. Some say that he's now in Russia for his own safety. But his factions that were under his control that are now splintering again are also opposed to Jolani and to some degree opposed to Israel. So they have been carrying out some attacks on the Israeli forces that are entering southern Syria and expanding their, I won't say occupation, but their presence on Syrian land. Going up, of course, then you've got Damascus, so you've got Jolani in control from Damascus, central Syria, which is kind of Palmyra and the desert area, to give people a clue, to Homs, and then to Hama, and then Idlib, and to a degree the coastal region, because of course that's where they've been carrying out the majority of the ethnic cleansing. The Homs governorate, and this is very important, it stretches from the Iraqi border through the center of Syria, very close to the Lebanon border. So this is a very important sector in Syria for Jolani to have control of. I think I've covered everyone except for Russia on the coast, of course. And we know to a degree, we've talked about before, the role of Russia in the final success of the regime change, the war that had been waged against Syria for 14 years. And we know that Russia sent Bogdanov very early on, the deputy foreign minister, to effectively normalize relations with Jolani after he was, or after he proclaimed himself the president of his al-Qaeda government, because his government is not representative of all of the diversity of Syria. It's made up almost entirely of former Takfiri al-Qaeda members that are still bearing that same ideology. The interesting thing, which I think we're going to talk about a bit later, is that there appears to be now emerging a possible collaboration between France and Russia on the coast. We know to a degree that Russia has been enabled to keep its military base and naval base and air base on the Syrian coast through cooperation with Israel, because initially Trump was including in the conditions that he was giving Jolani for lifting the sanctions and financial help for Syria, etc., that Russia must leave Syria. That has disappeared off the negotiation table right now, and I think that's down to Israel lobbying for Russia to stay. Again, as we've mentioned before, because that plays into Israel's favor to prevent Turkey's expansionism and to enable Israel to have the majority of the control over Syria. What is now happening, I'll just mention what's happening with the Druze, and then you can interrupt me and come up with another question, because otherwise I can keep talking for an hour because there's so much to go into. Yeah. Look, we've been hearing, of course, Jolani was put into power by Israel, by Turkey, by the Gulf states, by the US, by the UK, predominantly. Those are the main countries that enabled his rise to power, including the grooming of him as a political opposition activist from 2021, 2020, 2021 onwards. And the US was responsible for keeping him in power in Idlib by effectively assassinating any of his competitors, any of his challengers for power amongst the hundreds of factions that were basically harboring in Idlib, dominated by Jolani and the former al-Qaeda, now known as HTS. But I think what we've been seeing is very much a switch for Jolani, just as he switched from ISIS to Al-Qaeda. He's kind of switched from Turkish patronage to being dominated by Israeli-US patronage. With the UK, of course, MI6 being responsible even now for the kind of scripting and grooming and training of the more visible members of his administration, his foreign minister, Jolani himself, and so on. And with that switch, we've seen, particularly in Israeli media, there's been a number of reports on secret meetings and back-channel discussions between Jolani and Israel with a view to finally arriving at a normalization between Syria and Israel. I think that's ambitious right now. I think what is more likely is this idea of a security agreement, with Israel coming to an agreement in Baku in Azerbaijan. Everyone has denied that any meeting happened between Netanyahu's representative and Jolani, but I just don't believe this. Israeli media is saying they did meet up. Jolani is denying it, but he has to, in my opinion, to prevent any backlash in Syria. And effectively what they've agreed to, according to Israeli media and according to how I read the situation, Israel perceives Jolani and the Takfiri forces under his control would be useful as a regional enforcer. So in other words, as I said, he will have control of that band of territory which goes from Iraq to Lebanese territory. That also means that they can prevent Iraqi resistance coming to the aid of Hezbollah in Lebanon in the future. But it also means it can act as a corridor for the ISIS factions, which we know are collaborating with Jolani, to go from the northeast through the center and potentially into Lebanon. It's also an area from which he can launch missiles at northern Lebanon. And he has made very clear in some of his negotiations that he believes he can annex northern Lebanon as part of what used to be known as Bilad al-Sham, which is Greater Syria. So in a sense, I believe that Israel is dangling this carrot in front of Jolani, that he can extend his territory into Lebanon. He can annex Tripoli in the north, areas of the Bekaa, which is on the eastern border. But as a result, he has to act as a regional enforcer for Israel. And that might also include going into Iraq to curtail the activities of the Iraqi resistance. So in my opinion, what we're actually seeing now, because what kicked off in Sweden kicked off immediately after the meeting in Baku in Azerbaijan, which is too much of a coincidence. So I think this was part of what was discussed. So all of this is actually being orchestrated, again, in my opinion, but in the opinion of many people I'm speaking to in Syria and many other analysts from the region. And in reality, of course, Israel is not going to allow HTS to come into the southern area, because that's what Israel perceives to be its area, the same as it's not going to allow Turkey to encroach upon central Syria, right? So Israel is still deciding the borders, deciding the boundaries. But Israel doesn't have the manpower to occupy more territory in Syria. So it's looking to use the Druze, the factions of the Druze that are with Israel, the Israeli Druze and the Lebanese Druze that also are aligned with Israel, to occupy that territory and to hold it for Israel's use, just as they're using the Kurds to settle on Syrian territory in the northeast. That then potentially enables them to achieve the David corridor, which will run from the south through Sweden, up the eastern side of Syria, through the northeast, and eventually reach the Euphrates in Iraq. Because we have to remember, the one thing Israel doesn't have is water. The occupied Golan territory supplies something like 30% of Israel's water needs. So water is very high on Israel's needs, and the areas that it's now taken in southern Syria are also the main water basins and water sources for both Syria and Jordan. And I think I'll stop there because before I completely confuse everyone anymore.
Well, I just wanted to lay out that a couple of things here. Obviously, the mainstream media, the Washington Post in particular, has framed this as Israel going in to save the poor, persecuted Druze
Yeah, of
factions
course.
and helping them out, right? This is just very basic things that they do.
Mm.
And so that's not surprising. But I guess what really was a lot of people's question is, what will they do with Jelani? And it doesn't seem to me like immediately Jelani is going to be taken out. However, if he has pretty much lived out his usefulness to a degree, and he will be eventually removed. What needs to happen for Jelani to then become useless? Because I think right now, at least, he does have some people that
Yeah.
support him and commend him for not
Yeah,
being
no.
kicked out of Syria, right? So
Mm.
is he still? I guess he's still useful to the moment, but there are others that you have laid out before that could
Mm.
potentially then take over, who are more in line, with MI6 and so on and so forth.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, for the time being, Jolani is useful. He has the control, particularly of the foreign tech theory, which kind of slightly surprised me, but then it made sense when it was explained to me that because basically in their perception, he saved them from being expelled from Syria because Trump flipped and from saying, no, you have to kick the foreign tech theory out, he's now saying, no, it's fine, you can incorporate them into the army. And I think that was part of Israel's plan to keep them available to use against Lebanon and Iraq, right? And so to a degree, those foreign Takfiri factions, which make up between 30 and 40% of his militia, are very loyal to him at the moment. So they can't flip him yet. They still need him. And also the core HTS militia are still also pretty loyal to him. And someone was saying, oh, well, wouldn't they bring in the Kurds? No, of course they're not going to bring in the Kurds, because bringing in the Kurds would totally piss off Turkey. That's not going to happen, because Turkey is, if you like, in one of the upper echelons. The Kurds are right at the bottom. I mean, they're dispensable as far as the US is concerned. As we've seen multiple times, the US cultivates these allies for the period of time that they're useful and then ditches them. And that is what, sadly, that is what will happen to the Druze. But of course, they're not seeing that, and they are being weaponized by Israel. And yeah, I've seen multiple articles being, I think Newsweek put something out today saying, oh, Israel's coming in to save the Druze from the dreadful terrorists. So for me, Jolani he's not at his sell-by date yet. The one that I would earmark to replace him would be his foreign minister, Asad al-Shabani, who was also with Jolani a co-founder of Al-Qaeda. But he's the one that seems to be favored by British MI6. He's the one that went to Davos and met Tony Blair. He speaks English. He's, according to sources, he's more intelligent. He's almost the one that is helping Jolani with the strategy. So long term, I think he might be a replacement. He'd also be a replacement which would be relatively seamless. If Jolani were to be sidelined somehow or assassinated or whatever they decide to do with him, he would be able to step up with very little kind of disturbance in the HTS leadership. And I think what I'm seeing happening is, because Jolani knows he's not allowed to take his guys into the south, because Israel is bombing them, just as it has done since December last year, because it's made it very clear, you don't come into the south, this is Israeli territory. To some degree, this also suits Jolani because he hasn't got the military manpower to be able to handle all of the complications in the south either. So for him, it's of benefit if Israel takes control and takes care of the south, to be honest. So I think what he's done is, between him and Israel, they've weaponized the tribal factions, the Syrian tribal factions. And I think it's something like 41 of the biggest tribes in Syria, which is an estimated 150,000 fighters. They're not all in Sweden. They're being sent in batches, but I saw just now like Arctic containers taking fighters down to Sweden. In a sense, what this reminds me of is the massacre of the Palestinians in 1982 in Lebanon, when the Zionists kind of opened the doors for the phalangists to go in and massacre the Palestinians. So the Zionists stepped back and said, okay, go on, you do it. This gives us plausible deniability. We're not responsible for the massacres. But still, the Druze that are against Israel and against Jolani can be massacred. The Druze can be put in a situation where they're like, oh, hell, please, like, let Israel in because we can't handle this level of brutality and sadism, exactly as we've seen on the coast, right? And Jolani keeps a distance, but I'm hearing he's letting them through the checkpoints. Like, he's established checkpoints just south of Damascus, but he's allowing them through. He's not stopping them. So it's clear to me that this is what is going on. This is orchestrated. And eventually even the anti-Israeli and anti-Jolani Druze will probably, unfortunately, come to a deal, because they're not going to be able to withstand this level of invasion and brutality.
Yeah, it does seem like they will come to some sort of agreement in a way, forcefully. This seems like a complete setup in simple terms, a setup,
Yeah.
a manipulation by the same people behind the scenes, using, of course, the terrorist factions and multiple factions against each other. This is, and the reason this is so hard for people to understand is because it's hard for people to look at something and think about what's going on behind the scenes. When they're looking at
Yeah, sure.
the Druze asking for Israel, asking for help, this is so easy for the Western media to frame it in such a way. Simultaneously, I wanted to touch on what's been happening in Lebanon, because I think this is all part of it. And you've published an article on UK Column, and you started talking about that, about Tom Barrack, and how Lebanon has basically shown they're capable of, particularly Hezbollah, how they've shown they're capable of not just defending themselves, but of pretty much fighting and defeating the Zionist incursion. And there have been recent attacks in Tripoli. Things have recently sparked there. What do you what is the context, like, of what's happening there with Hezbollah versus what's happening in Syria, and why are they happening simultaneously? Is this all then essentially part of the direct attacks towards achieving greater Israel? Because that's what it seems like to me. It seems like this is right on point with the multi-pronged attacks. Now, obviously, Israel can't handle all of this. Just like the United States, they're expanding themselves, overextending themselves. And I think this is why we're seeing attempts to ignite factional confrontations, to sort of just allow, as you said, let them destroy themselves. It really seems extremely nefarious and just a completely just diabolical to me.
Yeah, no, it is. And I mean, we talked about this, I think, last week, that the ceasefire with Iran is not only going to allow Israel to replenish its munition supply and so on, and prepare for the next stage. We talked about the fact that it's going to pivot towards weakening Hezbollah, or at least bogging Hezbollah down in a quagmire in Lebanon. That's also another, part of the agenda and the strategy. It doesn't necessarily need to annihilate Hezbollah, that would be very difficult. But it can keep it completely focused on Lebanon and unable, for example, to come to the help of Iran. Not that Iran has actually asked for Hezbollah's help or asked for any help from any of the kind of the ring of fire of resistance factions that are aligned and are allies of Iran. It hasn't asked for that help. But clearly what Israel wants to do is to prevent that happening in any scenario, right? And so we've seen Tom Barrack talking about Bilad al-Sham, and then, of course, he tried to backtrack that and say that, no, he was just talking about how well Syria is doing. We've seen Trump allegedly lifting the terrorist designation, which, of course, he hasn't really. He's only lifted one section of the terrorist designation, which means that they can... so he's lifted the foreign terrorist designation, but there's... I can never remember this one. The special terrorist designation, which has been in place on Syria for years anyway.
So real quick, just by default, Bashar al-Assad is no longer being sanctioned, correct?
Yeah, absolutely right. Part of the sanctions, I think it's more than 500 sanctions that Trump has lifted. A number of them were on Assad and on members of the former government, which is kind of quite funny for me. There's a degree of irony in that.
Yeah.
And so basically what this means, and I've talked about this in the article, what it actually means is Giuliani can travel. For example, he's supposed to be maybe meeting with Netanyahu at the UNGA in September. Again, you know, to me, this means that he's kind of going to be their puppet for a little bit longer. But at the same time, no one can give him weapons, no one can finance him, and so on. So it's a very kind of, you know, it's a cosmetic move by Trump, which is not very surprising. The Caesar Act is still in place, which is the most crippling of the sanctions on Syria, the one that really, in my opinion, brought about the breaking of Syria in the end in 2024. And so it's all a bit silly, really. It's all extremely cosmetic. And I think this was shown by a conversation between Shaibani, the foreign minister, and Rubio, where Shaibani actually didn't even thank Rubio. He just basically said, well, I hope you're going to do more. That's the conversation. I mean, he wasn't happy, let's put it that way, right? And so effectively, you know, Giuliani is being played, and he knows he's being played, but what choice does he have? Just as any puppet of the West, of the US, Zelensky is the same. What can he do? You know, they're not given any choice, basically. And he's made huge money out of this entire exercise anyway. So to some degree, it's payback time, I guess. And so what we have seen in Lebanon is, particularly since the Druze situation kicked off, we've seen protests up in Tripoli in the north in favor of HTS. We've also seen Lebanese Druze trying to go through the border into Syria to go and reinforce the Druze in Sweden, but they're being prevented from doing that by the Lebanese forces. There are, on an almost daily basis, terrorist cells being found and arrested by the security forces here in Lebanon. We know that the foreign Takfiris are building up their forces on the eastern border in preparation for a potential attack. There are Takfiri forces infiltrating, according to some reports, through the north. They're coming in by the sea into Tripoli and then entering the city itself. We don't know to what extent this is going to kick off in Lebanon, but in my opinion, yes, it's all linked. You know, it's no coincidence that this all happened after the Azerbaijan meetings and after Barak already made quite clear that Giuliani was going to be threatening Lebanon. And as I said, you know, they don't have to actually invade Lebanon. They can keep Lebanon busy on the borders. And Giuliani has been threatening to close the borders. He's been threatening economic pressure, which again is very ironic, on Lebanon. So in other words, cutting supply. Lebanon gets a lot of its pharmaceutical product from Syria. because Syria is the biggest manufacturer in the region, not only of Captagon, which, by the way, has continued. You know that Assad was the drug king and Syria was the narco state under President Assad. It's funny. It's really funny how Iraq keeps grabbing huge amounts of Captagon that are crossing the border, and how recently we've seen videos circulating of HTS and the tribal factions with huge amounts of Captagon in their possession. But, you know, another little propaganda stunt by the West that is going to be exposed, as all of them are in time, I guess. So yeah, I think you know, I don't. And just sorry, one other very important point. Trump. A lot of people are talking about now Trump will give weapons to Jolani to carry out the attacks against Lebanon and Iraq, but he's not going to give them anything other than light weapons, because he's not going to allow them to be strengthened to a point where they're a threat with Israel, right? So he's not going to give them air defense. He's not going to give them heavy weapons. He's not going to give them artillery. He's only going to give them light weapons. So in other words, what he's looking to create is a long war between Jolani and Hezbollah with light weapons, no air superiority. So this will be a war that can go on forever. Do you know what I mean? It would be like the war on the ground in Syria that went on for 14 years until it kind of stagnated in 2018. So they can keep that kind of war going forever without actually empowering Jolani to do anything about it and to defend Syria. So this will mean that Syria can continue to be used for its airspace by Israel, by the US, by virtually everyone that wants to, including Turkey, although Turkey would be, of course, prevented by the US and Israel.
And we talked about before how when Damascus was falling, how Syria would be carved up into multiple pieces, right? With I would say competing interests. We had Russia, you had Turkey, you had Israel, you had the United States, and you obviously also have the terrorist factions there. But the dominating forces, I think, right now, wouldn't they be Turkey and Israel? And there seems to be, I would say, conflicting forces competing in Syria for the most power, the most power grab there. Would you say then that this is going to come into play in terms of basically Erdogan not being able to achieve his Ottoman dream? Because I don't see Israel allowing Turkey in. Remember that they immediately bombed them and nothing really was done of the sort of thing. So it does seem like Turkey's like the odd man out. Like, this is not. It's like no. You get this far, and that's it. You're gonna get, I guess, the whatever we don't want, and that's it. And what it looks like to me is there's that aspect of it. The other thing I wanted to ask you more on was how critical this is for Israel in terms of what you mentioned, that Israel has no water, right? And I think a huge part of this is bringing not just water from the Euphrates, but also the corridors that we've been talking about, and how kind of Turkey is kind of, I guess, could potentially get in the way of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Turkey and Israel are going to try to avoid falling out. There's a couple of things here, though, that you're absolutely right about. First of all, we have to remember the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. Qatar is very much aligned with Turkey, and of course, Qatar poured billions into the regime change war and in producing the propaganda through Al Jazeera. We should never forget that. Because although they're ostensibly doing a good job on Palestine, they helped to destroy Syria, the number one supporter of Palestine in the region. And then you've got UAE, which is very much aligned with Israel. It was the first Gulf country to normalize with Israel back in 2020. And there's massive partnership and collaboration between Israel and the UAE and China to a large degree on developing authoritarian surveillance, Palantir type technology, right? So again, that also aligns with the US and the UK, etc., and the incoming techno-tyranny. And you have Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is kind of trying to straddle everything, basically, but it's because it's terrified of a war between Israel and Iran, ultimately, because it knows that it's going to be number one target. At the same time, it's heavily invested in Egypt. It's heavily invested in the India Middle East Economic Corridor, which will run through the Gulf states and Israel and in Egypt and into Europe. Of course, once they assume they're going to achieve the final solution in Palestine and the final end of the Palestinian cause. And so you've got also this as a very large bloc, which is involved and has interests in Syria. Turkey is also not happy about the involvement of Saudi Arabia because Turkey likes to portray itself as the head of the Muslim world being, of course, the Sunni Muslim, but predominantly Muslim Brotherhood and Takfiri world. So there's a competition there also. Turkey would be extremely unhappy if Jolani normalizes with Israel because Turkey perceives Syria being a sovereign country, but with Turkish dominance. So not being carved up. Turkey actually doesn't want Syria carved up other than on behalf of Turkey. So yeah, absolutely. There's going to be at some point, there have been clashes already. And they're still, as far as I know, negotiating some kind of, a deal whereby Turkey doesn't infringe on the boundaries that Israel has created inside Syria. The corridors, again, like the corridor, for example, that we discussed last week in Armenian territory, the Zangezur corridor or the Siunik corridor, which is allegedly going to be managed by American corporations, but is obviously very much controlled by Israel and Turkey. And Israel has been providing the weapons to Azerbaijan for years as well. So is there potential for a clash there? I'm not sure, because Israel needs Turkey, one, because Turkey controls the flow of the Euphrates. And we've seen Turkey cut off the water supply to Hasakah in northeast Syria before and actually deprive 2 million Syrians in Hasakah of water supply in order to put pressure on the Kurds, right? Because Turkey has built all of this dam system in Turkish territory. So Israel needs Turkey from this perspective. If it's going to build the David corridor to get all the way to the Euphrates and then suddenly Turkey turns the tap off, I mean, that's, it can't risk that, basically. And Turkey is perfectly capable of doing it. It's already done it in Syria. And of course, that down the line affects Iraq as well. So there's multiple reasons that Israel has to keep Turkey happy. And strategically, Turkey is huge. It's the largest military, I think, in the Middle East. So to a large degree, and that's where Russia fell foul of Turkey. It knew that it couldn't piss Turkey off because it needs Turkey for a multitude of reasons, for its own economy, trade, military, airspace, and so on. Many, many reasons. And Israel is very much in the same boat. The only thing is that Israel, of course, has the backing of the US because, as I said, the US sees everything through the Israeli lens, not through the Turkish lens. So remains to be seen. Could be that both of them use proxies against one another. That seems to be kind of the preferred method at the moment to carry through their own national agendas.
One of the things I've been seeing is, what they call us black-pilled, a lot of people, but we've actually kind of been, I feel like, more realistic on a lot of things. There's talk that there isn't any resistance left in Syria, that there's no resistance in general, that even the axis of resistance essentially can't really do much to get out of this. How does it benefit the resistance that Israel is coming in and just going full on, attacking multiple fronts, not just Syria, but Lebanon, Iraq? We're seeing these obvious Western-backed Israeli Zionist factions come in and use this chaos again, very, very much on play with the intelligence playbook that has been present throughout decades from the United States. How does this benefit the resistance for Israel to be the one behind the scenes doing this? And what do you think could be the potential for the resistance to actually rise up again? Because this is a very obviously dark time, a lot of terrible things happening daily. We're seeing the massacres. We have been seeing them in Syria, and now this has just gotten worse and worse. What do you think is the potential, I guess, silver lining or positives to what we're witnessing from a resistance aspect?
No, it is actually. The more Israel overextends, the more it is of benefit to the resistance. Partly because of the overextension, but also because if Israel violates international law to the degree where it actively occupies more Syrian territory than it is, than it should, on pretext whatsoever, and if it starts extending into the David's corridor and up the eastern flank, then that becomes an issue for the external resistance factions to Syria, because that then becomes a direct threat to those external resistance factions, which means that they have the legitimate right to defend their national security or their borders or their people or their villages from Zionist encroachment without necessarily needing Syrian green light for it. Because where all of the resistance factions have, of course, backed off from Syria is that unless or until there is a viable resistance movement inside Syria, they're not going to come and fight the war for the Syrians if the Syrians aren't asking them to, right? But Israel encroaching into Syrian territory is more likely to generate a reaction from people within Syria who've grown up with the history of the knowledge that Israel is the number one enemy. And a friend of mine was telling me there are conversations going on all over Syria at the moment on WhatsApp groups and so on about the fact that Israel is talking openly about sending Palestinians into Syria. And what they're actually saying, which kind of surprised me in a good way, they're saying, we don't have a problem with accepting Palestinian refugees, but what worries us is if we do this and under the new laws brought in by Jolani, which effectively take away the kind of Palestinian identity of the people coming into Syria. Assad always maintained their identity and enabled them the right to return. That's how he managed the situation, and they had full citizen rights. Under Jolani, they're going to become more of refugee status, and of course he's already disarmed the resistance factions, he's shut down offices, he's imprisoned the leaders, he's effectively weakened the Palestinian resistance inside Syria already on behalf of Israel. And so what these people are saying is, we're actually not happy with this because this will mean an end of Palestine, and we're not going to accept that. So for that reason, we're not going to accept the refugees. So if they're already thinking along these lines of the ramifications of Palestinians coming into Syria, then if it comes down to it and Israel takes a more overt role in the administration of areas of Syria, they're going to be against it automatically. And so therefore there's a greater chance of a resistance movement start on. And of course that's by design. That's being orchestrated, just as we were just talking about with the Druze. The tribal factions are coming in and they are literally massacring them, whole families. I mean, friends of mine sent me videos last night of around the area where they live. And it's horrible, it's horrific. But ultimately there'll be a hiatus in which people will start to think, no, actually, we're not happy with this. Do you know what I mean? And the further that Israel extends into Syria, the more it overextends itself economically, militarily. It's not going to be able to control all of these proxies, right? Because it doesn't have the manpower. It can't establish another Palestine inside Syria. It doesn't have the ability to do that. So in my opinion, there's the opportunity for there to be a resistance form inside Syria and for the resistance outside Syria, which includes the 80,000 to 100,000 Syrian Arab army who left back in to form a movement in order to support the resistance inside Syria. So that's where I see the opportunity arising.
Yeah, it's almost like I would say a backlash or a consequence of the Zionist overextension, because although the Zionist Israel has never actually respected international law or what is,
No.
what is the right of any of these sovereign states on either end. But I mean, I do see what you're saying. It's actually, I think, counterintuitive for a lot of people to think this way. So I'm glad you brought it up, because as I was saying, there's so much darkness and so many things happening that I think for most people it's like, well, where is the hope, right? Where is the hope? How does Syria get out of this? How does the entire region get out of this if they're constantly being attacked? And I think one way to look at it is it's a backfiring of everything that's been done, because there are, as you mentioned, a lot of factions that didn't necessarily like Assad, but also are seeing what's happened since, and are also seeing what Israel's doing, what Jolani is doing, and they want none of that. And it's almost like, in a lot of ways, the realization once something bad happens, people then tend to realize like where they went wrong. And I think that's the actual positivity in it for people who may have been begging for Assad to be ousted, seeing the repercussions of that, and how where Syria has gone since then. What would you say is, I guess, in summarizing this whole thing, is the connection to the targeting of Iran? Because from my perspective, it seems like this is all going back to destabilizing the entirety of the region, thereby leaving Iran either occupied and exposed, eventually isolated, using the Gulf states, right? Using the terrorist factions, using the organized chaos, the deliberate, complete and total attacks that we're seeing right now. How does this then affect Iran? And how do you think the US is viewing this as a potential to target Iran? And like I said, for me, it seems very clear that this, all in all, is to eventually target what they see as the greatest threat in the region, who they see as the potential foe that they now know can equally defend itself, that is not, at least from the resistance end, looking to stop the nuclear development, that it shouldn't. But that is a genuine threat to Israel, but also to Washington's plans. And for me, it seems like everything that is happening now is in a way done to target Iran and who they see as the next one to go, just to kind of bring it all together from a very macro perspective.
Yeah, sure. And I'd like to ask you your opinion about how Russia and China are also going to play this, because we were talking about that this week.
For sure.
Of course, this is all about heading towards, or part of, a component of the long war against Iran. And the point of the corridor, of course, is to get closer to Iranian borders, potentially have control of areas in Iraq, to be able to use the airspace, etc., to continue using the Syrian airspace. That's very important for Israel. It's, of course, before they couldn't because of the Syrian air defense under President Assad. Now they have carte blanche. They can do what they want in Syrian airspace, including launching attacks against Iran. And I think this is just, one step in that war. But from Syria, what they're now trying to create is this Takfiri hub, which, of course, ultimately is not going to be particularly good for Israel's security. But at the moment, under Jolani or whoever takes his place, they can use it and weaponize it against Lebanon, against Iraq, and eventually maybe even against Iran. I go back to that 2015 interview with Jolani where he talks about cutting off Iran's hands, which is the resistance, and then triggering the Takfiri elements on the borders with Iran and inside Iran. So that's a possibility also. And so, for me, I just think we're looking at, it's not going to be kind of a blitzkrieg war. It's not going to be over. It's not going to start next week and end a couple of weeks after or something like that. We're kind of in this for the long haul.
And the U.S. tends to drag things out that way, right? Washington dragged the war in Afghanistan, dragged the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that's obviously going to be dragged out. I mean, we're almost 4 years into the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, we're 3.5 years into it. It'll be December before we know it, and then it'll be 4 years in, and that's kind of like, I think, a good segue into the next thing, because the none of this has ended. None of what Donald Trump said he was going to do, he has done. I mean, I guess you could say when it comes to immigration, he ramped up the attacks on that, but he still managed to deport less people than Barack Obama. By the way, the numbers are still less. So he hasn't even satisfied people on that end. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, a good thing. It's more of like the things he has proposed he hasn't done. And when we talk about what's happening in Syria and everything that you laid out, which is, I think, extremely important in the context of what's happening also with the US and Russia and Iran and even China, there have been, I think, some shifts, and I definitely want to get your opinion on it. But I will start by mentioning the recent Trump, what basically, intelligence threats to increase tariffs, which essentially would be more sanctions on Russia, and to essentially target anybody that is doing business with Russia. So this past Monday, Trump did threaten to propose these steep tariffs, and he wanted to essentially not just that, but he is pretty much targeting Russia and Vladimir Putin in a way that we haven't seen. And I talked a little bit about it last time, but now there is a desire to send the Patriot missiles. And this is something that initially Donald Trump had pulled back from. But what we saw, as I discussed in the Big Beautiful Bill, was that there were clear money lines to more drone warfare, to more weapons, to more AI. And all of this was either going to be used for Israel or for Ukraine. They didn't specify which one, but it's billions, in the amount of billions. So the analysis was that this was obviously going to go on that route. And there was also some money for training and for the building up of ships in the South China Sea. And that is also in part, of course, to China, which I will point out in a second. But these Patriot missiles that Trump has threatened the tariffs, the sanctions, and he also had a conversation with Zelensky. And in this conversation with Zelensky, he asked Zelensky if he could potentially target Russians deep into Russia, particularly Moscow. Now, when Trump says things, I don't really say, oh, he said this, oh my goodness, because you have to take it with a grain of salt, because he'll say all sorts of things. But what I do see happening here is that he is not 100% in control. Like, this, it's just not been more clear. He is going back on everything he said because he is being made to go back on everything he said. And I think to a degree there was a desire an ego desire, like he's a narcissist. So coming from at it from that way, there was a desire from him to maybe win at something, right? Because this is how we've discussed this before. Yeah. Trump thinks like he wants to win. He wants to be the guy that like is recognized as the big bad guy. And so when he went into this, I think there was a desire to look good by ending a war. There was a desire to be the hero when it came to the Epstein files, but he thought he could do more than he actually can. And now he just looks like a complete, not just a neocon war criminal, but no different than the Democrats, than any sort of Democrat that was put up there, whether it was Joe Biden or would have been Kamala Harris, Barack Obama. When you call a huge part of your supporters conspiracy theorists and say that the Epstein files are a hoax, you're basically gaslighting them. And this has caused, of course, an uproar in the US, particularly because I think it is the turning point for a lot of people who finally have realized that your presidents don't run the country. And then you had Vladimir Putin come in and say that, essentially say that, the U.S. presidents change, but essentially the foreign policy does not. Now, I guess for me, it's interesting to hear Putin say that when they definitely had a different reception to the foreign policy from Donald Trump. They were a lot more, Russia was in particularly a lot more receptive to Trump, based on a lot of it comes from the conservative aspect, the conservative, I would say, affinity that they have, where the Republicans are not for the LGBTQ propaganda. They're not for this sort of liberal agenda. They kind of want to go back to a more Christian, more I would say, Cold War mentality. Though the good old days, they look at things like family and they want to go back to that. And so I think that there was a huge part of Russia that could align with that. And that came down not just to the government, but to the analysts, to a lot of people who went there and who really were kind of turned off by a lot of the liberal, very European type of liberalism has captured very much of the West. And so when you look at how Russia was reacting to that initially, how they were more than willing to normalize relations, and I think they are still being actually very diplomatic in spite of all of these threats, you look at that and say, okay, there was clearly, though, a shift after Iran. And I genuinely feel, based on the comments that I'm seeing coming from Russia, that there was also a wake-up call in terms of some of the political sector, where they're not necessarily as gung-ho about trusting anything the United States has to say. I'm not at the point where I think that they won't do that, but I am seeing that less than I was before. And I think that Iran, the attacks on Iran and Iran's retaliatory attacks, I don't think Putin was surprised by it. I think a lot of people were saying that, Putin didn't know that this was going to happen. I actually disagree with that, because there were many conversations had about how Iran and Russia don't have that strategic military defense clause, whereas Russia has it with North Korea. And we've discussed that many times. And Vladimir Putin was asked, one of the Russian envoys, I believe it was one of the ambassadors, was also asked during the threats, the ongoing back and forth between Washington and Tehran. And he was asked about if Russia would interfere on behalf of Iran if the United States struck Tehran, or if Israel struck them. And they said no. Vladimir Putin reiterated like this wasn't a thing, and that Iran had never actually. They had offered Iran some jets, but they said no about this whole thing. And so a lot of that was conflicting because people were asking, why is Iran saying no? Did Iran say no? Is Putin lying? Is he telling the whole truth? Some people think that Putin is incapable of lying, and I say to that, like, I think these are all politicians. They're all very well capable of omitting, of reframing things. So don't be naive. No matter how much you like Putin or how many T-shirts you have or whatever you may have, I think that there's people that have like elevated him and others to this sort of deity that it just doesn't work. And we've talked about this with China and Russia in particular, but I do think there has been a shift because I see that it's not just happened in the United States, which is very clear, but it's happened in Russia. And I think there's a grappling as to how to proceed because of the Washington Israeli actions. However, I'm not fully there to say that Russia is going to 100% back Iran, because I think there are not the same ideological objectives. Russia has these pragmatic objectives, and as long as its economy is growing, as long as it's building partnerships and relationships with pretty much everybody that it seeks to build them with, including Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's increasingly gotten closer to Saudi Arabia. It has this love-hate relationship with Turkey, where it knows it needs Turkey, but it also doesn't particularly like Turkey. And so this is a back and forth with Turkey. It is trying to develop and increase its influence in Africa, as we've seen, and also in, I would say, the Southeast Asian countries, and as well as India and Pakistan. Russia's relationship with India is actually extremely strong. You can't really criticize the Indian government. Like it's rather, from a Russian perspective, they rarely ever criticize you, even when they deserve it. So you have the Russian desire to advance put against the very reality of the fact that Turkey and Israel will not leave NATO. They will never put Russia before Washington. And when you look at what's happening now and the targeting of Syria, of Iran, of Lebanon, and how this will move on this chessboard eventually in a few moves, you have Russia once again being targeted. You have Russia also being targeted via the Armenian Azerbaijani conflict, particularly obviously by Azerbaijan, and then the corridor. So, we've touched on this, but in the terms of the Russian reaction that I've seen through from Donald Trump, where Russia has just said, I think it was Dmitry Medvedev, he just said that Russia's going to continue moving forward. They're not going to stop. They're not going to halt what they're doing. We haven't heard any more about any sort of talks, of course, mediated by Turkey. Where does this then, leave Russia? I find myself kind of going back and forth between this, because I do see them knowing, they very well know what is happening. They know what the United States is doing. But is that enough to drive them away from their connections to Israel? I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case. So
no, I don't think Russia will. Yeah, I don't think Russia will abandon Israel for anything. And it's interesting because by not abandoning Israel, that also means that you're going to have to come on board with the United States and the allies, the entire kind of Zionist bloc. That's unavoidable. And that includes Europe. It includes the UK, right? And I actually wonder, we were talking about this before we started recording. I find it kind of amusing that there is potential now for France and Russia to combine on controlling the coastal region. Of course, for the Alawites, historically, that's fine, because previously France was in control under the French mandate after Sykes-Picot and so on. There was, in fact, an independent Alawite state under the French mandate. So the Alawites, to some degree, would be kind of quite happy with that after everything that Jelani has been doing to them. But it's sort of interesting. And again, I was talking about this today with someone in Syria, and he was like, but I don't get it. I was like, yeah, I actually remember back in 2019, the Benalla scandal in France, where Macron had paid out of government funds this head of his security, Benalla, to take care of like the best friends of Putin in Paris, to offer them security and limos and all the full-on red carpet treatment for some of the, I think at least one oligarch that was very, very close to Putin. And then I was looking through today, and there was a report in Carnegie Endowment, I think it was, where they're talking about this amazing relationship that Macron and Putin had, where Macron even invited Putin to his family home on the Riviera rather than, a rather cold meeting in Versailles. And actually, they were pretty buddy before the SMO. And in my opinion, Macron is, as much as I loathe him, he's the last, what can be described in some ways as a leader in Europe. This is just my opinion. I mean, the bar is not high. Let's also put it that way, right? But since Germany, replaced Merkel with the faceless creatures that are now running policy in Germany and just basically genuflecting at the feet of the Zionists and the US, right? But no, Macron had a very close relationship with Putin, and it's very interesting for me that on Tuesday it was Macron that called Putin after 3 years of silence between them to talk to him about the Ukraine issue. Now, has Trump contacted Macron and said, "Look, I know that you two have a good relationship. Can you try and talk to Putin?" Do you know what I mean? I'm quite sure this kind of thing goes on. But I just find it really interesting that at this stage that there is a potential for Russia and France having to collaborate in the coastal area of Syria. Trump, obviously, as you said, pretty much failing at coming to any kind of negotiation, failing or deliberately failing. We also have to keep that in mind. And suddenly Macron steps in. I just kind of find the whole timing quite interesting. And it sort of wouldn't surprise me, because at the end of the day, both Germany and France need Russia. They don't want to be dependent on American energy supply. That would be a disaster, and it would also absolutely cripple their economies. And that has always been the case. The war against Ukraine is being pushed by the UK in order to weaken the EU, and by the US for similar reasons, right? Under Merkel, we talked about this. Germany was trying to pivot towards Russia, but it's occupied by American bases. It's not going to be allowed to do it. And of course, Merkel also blew the whistle on the Minsk agreements once she was no longer in power, and said that they were never intended to actually succeed. They were just intended to give NATO time to prepare for the war against Russia, right? So I don't know. I think I agree with you on Turkey. I think everyone views Turkey as a necessary evil. Even the EU does, and that is down to its geographical location, to many things. with or without Erdogan, Turkey is always going to be pivotal to the region because of where it is, and because actually it controls a lot of the oil resources, the water resources, the corridors. As I said, many of them are going to traverse either Turkey itself or areas that are somehow influenced by Turkey, like Azerbaijan, also Israel. So yeah, that's my reading of the Russian role. Where it quite ends up, I really don't actually know. I mean, Putin has put out, a pretty standard statement of we're very concerned about what's going on in Syria, but the thing is, so much is on fire at the moment. That's all we hear from the UN, from all of these world leaders, is condemnation and concern. That's it. That's really as far as it goes. It's just a kind of diplomatic loop.
Yeah, it really does seem like Israel is a red line for Russia, right? It really does seem like they will not go further. And it's not everybody, but it's a huge portion of the government that is in power. And so I have a hard time seeing how that's going to just go away, because we've also seen Israel attack Russians. We've seen the Washington Zionist backed factions attack Russians as well, the terrorist factions. And so what align with Ukraine specifically too. So if that didn't do it, what's going to do it? Yeah, what's going to actually make them say, no, we really have to take a stance against Washington and by default, then Israel, because we do know that there is Zionist influence already in Russia, and Putin, growing up with that influence as well, has a very, very emotionally driven actually spot for them, because it's he's a very logical person, but when it comes to Israelis in particular, I think that's where the emotion comes in. That's where there's less logic, because logic would say you need to watch out, you need to make alliances where they will benefit you in the long run, because any sort of alliance with the United States, eventually, especially if you're Putin, will end up in a very deadly or dark place. And I don't think he's unintelligent to not realize that. I think he is an intelligent person, but there's a difference between that and really fully going after Israel. So I think it's hard to say where Russia will end up. But what I am seeing is there is sort of starting to be this realization of that this isn't going to be as easy as we thought. I think they thought they could go in, make a deal with Trump, and Donald Trump would actually follow through. They genuinely did think that. And now they've realized, oh, okay, that's not really going to happen. And it's also people, I think, working in media and people living in Russia have realized that that's not the case. The opinion of Donald Trump has gone to the toilet, whereas it was at least somewhat positive in the beginning. In Russia, it's gone to the toilet at the local people level, where you're seeing people not talk about him favorably as they were before. And so not necessarily saying that's going to have a lot to do with where the government goes, but the other part of this is the US also attacking China via they're deploying US HIMARS rockets, and they're going to be using them in these annual drills, and that's going to be in obviously the South China Sea, and they're going to be weapons that are capable of reaching these Chinese ports. And so that is something that China has been very much against. On the other hand, as you mentioned, China still has a strong relationship with Israel, an economic one, and that is pretty much also blatant for everyone to see, but it's not talked about. It's like the thing you can't talk about. And they also have a relationship with Saudi Arabia, and they're very much invested in AI and this sort of technology. In a way, so is Russia. I've seen in several of the conferences, for example, at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum and at the last BRICS, there's a heavy emphasis on understanding artificial intelligence, on developing in technology and technological advancements in an effort to compete with the West and not be left behind in this way. So, this is why people haven't viewed it as negatively, because they say they're doing it in an effort to compete against the West and to not be left behind, because in many ways, that's not a lie. If the United States is advancing, they have to advance. It's almost like the Cold War, right? You're still, if you do this, we're going to do this, and so on and so forth. And this is how things have developed. But I just, what I'm seeing here is there's a very clear targeting and just complete and total vilifying of Russia right now, coming from the Trump administration, which was supposed to be chummy with Russia. And so that shift, I think, was always meant to happen. I think that was the point of Trump coming in, was to give the idea, the pretense that this was going to be Russia was going to be, the Russia-Ukraine war was to be used to gain support, ending it. And then, of course, once you're in there, then clearly the intelligence of machine apparatus wants to go to war with Russia, at the very least control these sectors. I'm trying to figure out how this will end, other than in a greater war, because I don't see, for all that we've talked about Russia, I don't see them giving up the Donbass region. I don't see them giving up Lugansk. I don't see them giving up the Kherson and the territories that they've gained so far. I don't see them going back on that. I don't see them allowing NATO troops near on Ukraine. I don't see them having a momentary ceasefire with no security guarantees. So because I don't see that, I have a hard time thinking that it's going to come from them. It's going to come, it seems like, from a military battlefield. And another thing on the Russia-Ukraine aspect is that BlackRock, who was going to be investing there, just dipped out and got out of Ukraine. So that's an interesting point that's happened recently, almost like they're saying it's not worth the investment. I'm wondering if Russia does come out somewhat victorious out of this, if the United States then will attempt to make some sort of negotiation, and that's how we would potentially see a normalizing of relation with them. Right now, what we're getting vocally from Trump is, yeah, Zelensky, go take out Moscow. Yeah, okay, EU is going to pay for these weapons that we're getting to Kiev. The EU is going to pay for it. There's, as you said, there's no spine in the European Union left. I mean, they're all spineless, so they're not going to do anything about it. And so what it seems like to me is he's saying all of these things, but is the United States even actually going to do anything for Ukraine? I'm kind of more so seeing that they're sort of like putting it on the EU, and they're like saying, all right,
oh, definitely,
pay for it. Yeah. So I don't know. That's I find myself thinking about this, because I think at this point there was supposed to be some sort of negotiation, and things have shifted in the wake of the Iran conflict, and then also the Trump shift after that. The Trump shift happening after that left me a lot to think, because before that, the I would say the verbiage, I would say the conversations with Russia were ongoing after Iran happened. That's when
Mm,
started seeing the shift. And so now I'm wondering if that has anything to do with it. And I'm feeling like there is a layer of worry of the relationship between Iran and Russia, even though um, it's very clear to me that it's not as, as optimistic as some people online make it out to be, that Iran and Russia are allies and they're just going to go to war together and defeat the evil, Zionist Anglo Empire. Like, it's not. I don't see that, but I also see that there have been some adjustments made. So, yeah,
mm,
that's the latest on Russia Ukraine. I'm still
mm.
formulating my full on thoughts on that, um, because there's so much
I,
to look out for.
yeah. Oh God, yeah, no, it's. I also wonder. I was just thinking while you were talking there, because we know that Israel has stepped in to basically keep Russia in Syria,
Mm-hmm.
and there's potential that Israel was already lobbying for the Russia-Ukraine issue with Trump even before he was inaugurated. There's strong potential for that, in my opinion. And I also wonder if ultimately the Zionists are not going to put pressure on Trump to do a deal with Putin, because it's in Israel's interest to some degree. And that could even be used as leverage against Russia as with regards to Iran. I mean, I'm really thinking out
Yeah.
loud here, but knowing how Israel works, I'm wondering if they will try and tie Russia into more of a low grade or a downgrading of the partnership with Iran.
Yeah. No, that's a possibility, because then that would allow uh, perhaps a deal with Russia and the US eventually,
Yeah.
as long as Russia stands by and does not
Mm.
interfere in any way, shape, or form
Yeah.
on behalf of
Just
Iran.
just thinking.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a possibility. I feel like we're having a moment where we're just like stream of consciousness on air. Like,
Thinking
it's
out
like,
loud.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh my
Anyway, it's
goodness.
been an hour and a half, so maybe
I
we should let
know.
people have a
We should
rest
let
from
you
us.
all, yes, kind of chew on everything that's been said here. So yes, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into this rather deep, and also this is one of the streams or shows you're probably gonna have to listen to more than once, because there's a lot here. I do that sometimes. I have to
Yeah,
sort
me
of do
too.
it sometimes, because it's like, and then I'll listen to things on like speed because I don't
Yeah.
have time. So I'm just like, and then I have to listen to it again, and it's the ADD aspect of me as well. But um,
No, I get it.
everybody, thanks for watching. Vanessa, let everybody know about your article, what you have going on, and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, basically every week I'm trying to do like a regional update on different sections of what's going on at UK Column, and then I'll be republishing at my Substack. That's the main one, really, where people can follow my work, and of course X and Telegram and all the rest of it.
Yes, X, and wear your shadow band as always.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, I have a couple things coming up on the Substack regarding Russia, Ukraine, and
Great.
then that should be something to look forward to. And then yes, this, and also Truthwire with Pasta and Matt on Mondays and Wednesdays. That's where it should be happening now. And that's it. And yeah, go ahead and find me on X, Fiorella Isabel M, and Telegram, Fiorella in Moscow. And thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you next time on Critical Perspectives. I hope you enjoyed and continue to do a little bit of research on beyond what's being said out there in the mainstream and alternative mainstream. We'll see you next time. Bye.